Once the Brits got a hold of New York punk rock, specifically through the music of the Ramones, they embraced it and the genre exploded. It is in England where the fashion blossoms, the aggression soars, and arguably the most commercial aspects of the genre develop. British youths had many different reasons to be frustrated. The economy was in the tank, and England had a class system that was very divided and difficult to break away from. English youths felt misunderstood and angry. Punk rock and punk culture gave them an outlet for their angst. In the last slide lecture, Malcolm McLaren was introduced. He would facilitate the forming of what would become punk rock's most visible bad boys, the Sex Pistols. The story as told by John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, was that he wandered into McLaren's fetish shop, called Sex, donning green spiked hair and a self-styled t-shirt. The t-shirt had previously been a Pink Floyd shirt, but Lydon had added "I hate" above the Pink Floyd name. In England this was sacrilege. Pink Floyd was the hometown band that dominated the scene. This is precisely why Lydon hated them. McLaren could not have found a more suitable frontman for the band the Sex Pistols. Their music was basically New York-inspired distorted chords backing up Johnny Rotten's sneered screams. He adopted the name Johnny Rotten due to the rotten nature of his teeth. The Sex Pistols became the voice for thousands of angry British youths. When reviewing the historical record of punk rock, the Sex Pistols were just a blip on the timeline, but their quick rise and complete disregard for the established ways of rock will keep them firmly placed as the British poster band for punk rock in the late 1970s. By their last concert in San Francisco, bassist Sid Vicious was so high on heroin that he wasn't playing anything. Johnny Rotten was disgusted with the entire scene and walked off the stage, never to perform again as a Sex Pistol. The film Sid and Nancy captures the decline of Sid Vicious. His life ends violently and miserably. The Sex Pistols' influence extended to many bands in England and beyond. The Clash began as a backing band for the Pistols, mostly since they could not play their instruments very well at all in the early days. The members of the Clash did have more musical abilities than many of the bands entering the scene. The Clash signed quickly with CBS, going against the DIY philosophy by avoiding corporate rock, and it was a disaster. Sadly, they are an example of how not to sign a contract in rock. They ended up having to pay for many basic elements of their tours, recordings, and promotions out of their own pockets. It seems CBS was not really willing to take much of a risk on this new punk rock music without some financial safety net in place. By their third album, The Clash was well established as musically strong, politically charged Brit punks. They also paid homage to the King, Elvis Presley, by emulating his historic album cover. This album and subsequent records by the band begin to show influences of other styles like reggae, ska, and pop music. Some in the punk scene felt that their sound became more commercial, therefore they must be sellouts. But as we can see now, punk needed to evolve or it would completely die out. Some say it did. Be sure and watch the video in this week's block for their song Rock the Casbah. Like so many other bands, the infighting, business problems, and creative differences split the band up in 1984. The sudden death of frontman Joe Strummer in 2002 eliminated any thoughts of reunion. They will remain, however, as one of Britpunk's strongest bands, influencing countless generations of other artists. The LA scene was also thriving. West Coast punk rockers had different issues to address, such as corporate greed and phony, pretentious Hollywood. The band X was more in the poet tradition of artists like Patti Smith or Richard Hell. They set their poetry to Ramones-inspired rock music. They also had a unique element about them. One of their lead singers was a woman, Exene Cervenka. Her punk-style moaning, combined with her then-husband John Doe's vocals, created punk duets. Please note who their producer was: former keyboardist and principal songwriter for The Doors, Ray Manzarek. Unfortunately, the West Coast punk scene was becoming more and more violent. Cervenka describes the audiences as spitting on the band. This was not something the band appreciated, but apparently in England it was viewed by some as a compliment. West Coast punk takes a decidedly more violent and aggressive tone in both the music and the club scene. It is in the West where mosh pits thrived and became mini battle scenes. The clothing took on a more military-inspired look, and offshoots of mainstream punk rock began, such as neo-Nazi punk. If punk rock did not already have a bad reputation from Britpunks, it certainly gained one now. Police raids of punk clubs were rampant, with riots breaking out all over suburban Los Angeles. In San Francisco, the band The Dead Kennedys upped the intensity of their music and political content, which helped create the subgenre hardcore. The hardcore music that many audiences are familiar with currently is much more intensive and aggressive than the early Dead Kennedys sound, but they are the pioneers of this subgenre due to their overall intensity and stage performances by frontman Jello Biafra. It might seem a surprise to some that reggae is included in this lecture, but this music was gaining in popularity worldwide simultaneous to the punk scene. In fact, reggae is the rock music of Jamaica. Its origins come from the slums of Kingston, Jamaica, through ska music. The themes are historical, political, and inspirational. These were also themes that some British punk rock bands were addressing in their music. Another period of racism was fueling problems in England. so bands that adopted reggae or ska music did so in support of an anti-racist movement. The most recognizable face of reggae is Bob Marley, who helped spread this music internationally. This week we will discuss the documentary Marley, directed by Kevin MacDonald. Be sure and listen to Marley's hit Buffalo Soldier and follow along with the lyrics. This song shows Marley's keen understanding of history, African pride, irony, and U.S. politics. One of the popular British bands that fused their sound with reggae influences was the Police. The reggae influence can be heard on their hits Roxanne and Walkin' on the Moon. As the 80s continues, punk rock changed dramatically. Some say it died altogether. It still existed in an ongoing underground scene, but the commercialization of punk rock changed it forever. One of the most important historical elements that punk left in its wake was the rise of independent labels that finally broke apart the corporate rock world. For this, rock music owes quite a bit to punk rock. Our Rockin' in Time text describes this next subgenre of punk as depressed punk. Goth music had its own themes, fashion, and in some instances, sounds. It was a large and thriving style of music and fashion, and was one of the inspiring styles, along with Washington, D.C.'s hardcore music, to later scenes like emo. Tried and true punk rockers knew the end was in sight when suburban moms could be seen wearing the fashion at the local mall. This went against everything that early DIY punk artists stood for. Commercialization was the death toll for punk rock. Virtually everyone jumped on the commercial punk bandwagon since it appeared this was now a money-making style. Fashion designer Vivienne Westwood's rise to fame was based almost solely on inspiration from punk rock. So, is punk rock really dead? Or did it morph into some other, and some may say better, genre?